Caitlin, hello, how are you?
Hello. Hi. I've never been in a room with people who've read my book, so thank you. I'm honored that all of you took the time to read this chapter and you showed up to talk about it today.
Yeah, thank you. We had an enormous amount of fun on Tuesday, kind of picking it apart. So I've been really looking forward to. I think lots of people have been looking forward to this. So maybe a nice thing to do to start would be to do some like contextualizing. So, how did you come to write this book, and why did you write it? And maybe also if we could weave in like a little bit about your kind of method here, because a lot of the audience here are either sort of philosophers or archaeologists. So it might be a bit helpful to sort of explain to them what do you do?
I showed up as an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, and I really wanted to be a biologist. Um, and the year before, I'd taken a summer camp for high school students called Stones and Bones, led by Paul Sereno, who's a famous paleontologist and a big ego. And you've probably seen him on National Geographic, et cetera. And so he took us out into the field for 2 weeks and we like dug up fossils and, slept in tents. And it was brilliant. I had the best time. I really should have been an archaeologist for those of you who are that. I should have done that. And then when we came back, I volunteered in his fossil preparation lab as a volunteer or as a preparator. I was just, 18, and supervised by an undergrad who knew a little bit more than me, but not a lot. And so she sort of guided me through how to take rock off of bones. I write about this in the book, actually, as a little piece of autoethnography about my own first prep test, where they decide whether somebody has the potential to become a good preparator before they give you any training. They like hand you a fossil and a tool and they say, prepare that, which is crazy, right? That they think that it's this innate ability to use your hands and use your eyes, and be patient. And if you can't prepare the fossil in that first half hour that they give it to you, they don't let you come back. Anyway, read chapter 2 for that. So I passed. I volunteered there the rest of the year, and then I went to that university for undergrad. And so I worked in that lab as I'm doing these like intro to chemistry courses or whatever. And then I went to London for a semester to study abroad, and I volunteered at the Natural History Museum there. And really, it was there that things started to get complicated, because what I liked about working in the lab was that it was really different from my very challenging coursework. It wasn't reading. I didn't have to write, right? I was using my hands. It was dirty. I don't know. It just felt sort of so different from the rest of my life that it was really relaxing, and I got paid. And so in London, I showed up thinking I was hot shit because I'd been preparing for like 3 years by then. So I thought I knew what I was doing. And the preparators there were like, you can't use any of the tools that you're used to. We use a totally different set of glues. How dare you even think about using, non-removable super glue on this fossil? They were like offended at my American trained ways. So that one was when I started to be like, how can you prepare fossils differently and still compare them? How can they be the same? How can they serve as the same data source, without any documentation of how they were prepared or by whom? And by this point, I'd given up on biology and I was studying history and philosophy of science. And I started to, it really shook me, actually. Like, it really shook my sense of science as reliable and objective, because I was like, we don't know, like, if they're letting me prepare this fossil with no documentation and no training, really, like, how on earth can that fossil be a reliable source of data about past life? So I sat on that for a year and was uncomfortable. And I went back to college. I graduated. I went to Cambridge to study HPS, really just for fun. And I did my first master's essay about a fossil preparator I'd worked with at the Natural History Museum in London. And I basically interviewed him about one project to try to figure out, like, what does prep look like from start to finish on one project. And then that little essay became my dissertation, really because I was fascinated by the control that preparators have over data about past life, and the lack of recognition, the lack of documentation, the lack of metadata that preparators are creating. And that just seemed like a big problem, like a big epistemic problem, also a big moral problem. I really wanted preparators to get some credit. They were not authors on papers really anywhere in either of the countries I'd prepared in. They have a wide variety of training and backgrounds, so they don't share a master's degree that might unite them, for example. Some of them went to college, not all of them. A few have PhDs, very, certainly not many. Some of them have studied science, not all of them. So I was just like, what makes this community so trustworthy to the scientists that they're allowed to decide what counts as fossil, right? What counts as specimen? So yeah, then I tried to get this book published for a decade. And eventually it got published. And so the final product, I did that thing where you're just trying to get the thing published. And I made a giant claim about all of science and all of knowledge in the hopes of broadening beyond this very specific case study of fossil technicians. And so, yeah, I proposed this new model of thinking about science as I was thinking about social construction, which of course is the bedrock of my field of science and technology studies. I propose a new model of social construction that focuses on the fact that knowledge production is ongoing and iterative and never finished, and therefore we should call it preparing. So kind of a shout out to my fossil preparator buddies, and also a call to remember that the process of construction is never finished, unlike when you construct a building or whatever, and then it's done. Knowledge is always in the process of being prepared. Even if we think we're really settled on a fact, as you well know in philosophy of science, like we're going to change our minds later. It's just a matter of time. And so the chapter I gave you to read, really, I was trying to answer this question that Adrian and all other philosophers always ask me, which is, how does fossil preparation matter for the science, matter for the knowledge? And I really didn't have any good data to answer that question, as I write about in the chapter. And this is kind of the methodological, sketchy part, that I really wasn't sure how to study the effect of preparation on knowledge itself. Like, I knew it mattered. I can say that it matters for sure. But how it matters is really hard to connect because the time periods are so long. Like a fossil can be prepared and sit in a collection for centuries and then be studied. And so how do you know what the preparation was then? It's not documented, right? So I could really only document the preparation that I saw happening. And then it takes years for scientists to study those fossils and publish it. And there's no counterfactual, right? Like if that preparator had removed this chunk of rock and not that one, would the scientist have interpreted that bone as a different species or as different evidence of whatever, predation or feathers, right? Skin impressions. And so I found that really hard to answer. And this chapter is my attempt to bring together my methods, my ethnographic methods. So I hung out in 14 fossil prep labs, mostly in the US, some in the UK, some in Canada, a couple with Adrian. And I studied what people were doing and why they were making the decisions they were making about tools and techniques, who they were assigning to prepare certain kinds of fossils, how they decide what a volunteer gets to work on, what a staff preparator gets to work on. What does it mean to be a preparator versus a scientist versus a collection manager versus a display designer, right? All these other people who are in sort of the fossil universe. And they are missing in this chapter because they're in an article. And this chapter is really about the scientists and the technicians. And so from my many months of hanging out and interviewing people who work with fossils, I saw really interesting distinctions in how scientists and preparators represented themselves to each other and to themselves. So like their identities were different. They were working really hard actually to define themselves as separate groups with separate responsibilities and separate kinds of expertise, which is weird because really they work together so closely. But then maybe that's why they felt like they needed to distinguish themselves. And scientists in particular are very dismissive of preparators. They see them as just technicians. Preparators don't fit in the academic hierarchy of who has a PhD and who has a million publications, right? Like that's just not relevant for preparators. And so scientists just dismiss preparators as not relevant to knowledge making, but important for getting their specimens out of the rock. And so I was trying to capture that in this chapter, but with a focus on epistemology. What does this mean for the fossil? And so that's the last part of the chapter about the fossil sturgeon. I wrote like in the month before the book was published. It's totally new. All the rest of it is like I'd been churned over many, many, many times. But that last case study I wrote because I was just like, I really need an example of this. And so I called up the two people who are sort of the stars of that section, Connie Van Beek and Lance Grand, and had them talk me through those two papers they wrote. Because I knew that Connie had written that paper and it was really an unusual report about how she dealt with this very unusual and very challenging fossil and very important fossil that turned out to be a holotype of a new specimen, a new species. And so in that case, I had valuable data that was in the documentation, two papers, one by a team of scientists and one by a team of preparators. And I had interviews with those two groups. So sort of the between the lines kinds of reports of what they had done with that fish and why. And so that's the closest I've gotten to being able to demonstrate how a preparator's decisions and values, right, what she's trying to achieve, influence how scientists are going to make sense of that fossil.
Yeah, that's so I have to say that I had sort of three opening questions planned. One was tell us about how the book got there and method one I asked you. The other one was another one was how does this chapter fit into the book? Then the third one was what's important about understanding the role of fossil preparators, and you just answered those three questions unprompted. So that makes my job very easy. Yeah, I found the discussion of the sturgeon really interesting because I take it that you want to say something like one of the discussions we had that we're going to sort of circle around to, I imagine, a few times is this question about how underdetermined are the fossils, right? What is the likelihood of you getting artifacts sort of in fossil prep or something like this? And I take it that one thing you want to know when you're answering that question is what's the journey between the sort of fossil to the, as it were, the interpretation or the sort of published paper. And what's really interesting about the sturgeon case is it really is like a sort of novel preparation technique and indeed novel sort of ways of kind of handling metadata, right? I love that the sort of the container with that's just such a cool idea. That's really clever. And I take it that the sorts of interpretation, they could only do some of the interpretation they did in virtue of this thing being disarticulated. And so it's a kind of thing where it's like, if this person had followed the more usual approach in fossil preparation, which is this thing's articulated, so like, keep it like that, because that's incredibly important. We don't want to lose that information. That actually some, at least, of the richness of the information, the knowledge that we generated on it, really turned on these particular features of these fossils. And what's kind of nice about that is I take it that sort of shows something like, well, actually, how it's prepared can make a really big difference to the kind of knowledge claims that are made. Was that sort of a fair way of putting what you were trying to say in that last discussion?
Totally. Yeah, I thought that the discussion, sort of the argument between the preparators and the scientists about whether they should disarticulate was really demonstrative of what these two groups care about. So scientists are greedy. They want all the access, right? All the data. They don't really care about the longer lifespan of the fossil. That's a little unfair because they kind of care morally, but like in terms of productivity and their jobs, like they care about getting the most amount of data right now. Really like yesterday, right? They're in a huge hurry. And so, yeah, I was trying to show that like Connie did push back against some of those demands, but she did in the end, you know, they reached a compromise where they did disarticulate this gorgeously preserved fossil. And they tried to justify it in different ways. So you saw the sort of triangulation of different kinds of data that they claimed they took a lot of photographs and they did drawings. They had specimen drawings made of various stages of the disarticulation. So they're trying to cover their asses really to make this ethical argument for why they should destroy the data about how the bones fit together. So yeah, I think what I was trying to say was that like not only did Connie's physical work of removing these incredibly small and delicate bones create that specimen that they could then access, but also the way that she talked about it, the way that she pushed back, the way that she said, do you want to see this angle or that angle? You know, is it okay if I'm going to break this one to reach that other bone? Or she found the denticles, right? She called the scientist down to the lab and was like, I don't know what these are. These little tiny like shards of bone floating around in the matrix, around in the rock around the fossil. And they were like, neither do we. And so Connie collected them, and, so yeah, it's not just the work of her hands, but also how she was pushing the scientists to do their work, I think is a key role that fossil preparators play, and that I think a lot of technicians and sort of other research workers play in terms of pushing the scientists to not be so greedy, to sort of introduce other values into the system beyond optimize data access now.
Yeah. So one thing that's really cool about that, I take it, is that people who work in, say, the more social epistemology side of science, we're going to talk a lot about division of labor and this kind of thing. And one thing I really like about your point is that it's not simply that you have division of sort of epistemic resources, you have sort of a certain division in terms of aims and values. And the knowledge kind of comes out of a sort of negotiation, in a sense, between those values. And I guess one thing that's kind of really interesting is, of course, what you're describing is this wildly asymmetric negotiation, right? Where, in a sense, the fossil preparators are having to use really fascinating techniques, let's call them. I'm sure they don't think of it like this, but when you're thinking of it from the sort of abstracted thing, these really sort of interesting ways of asserting themselves. And you might think that that's, if this picture is right, where actually maybe we think it's a good thing, I think it seems good to me, that negotiation happens, right? I want the sort of voracious destructive data hunger of the scientist to be constrained in useful ways, and this is the way that happens. But it's interesting that this turns on these kinds of highly social, like jokes and assertions about creativity, and also weirdly by the paleontologists undermining it is something I find really, really interesting, because of course, as you sort of mentioned, there are things that philosophers keep saying to you. And one of the things I really love in this chapter is when you sort of bring up one of the things that philosophers like me always say, which is, of course, this division of labor makes sense because of, theory ladenness. And so it's perfect to have a group of people who don't know about paleontology, they don't know the biology during the preparation, because then they can't be affected by it. And I love that discussion, which I'd be interested whether that you put it in there specifically because you keep getting asked this. But I really like the way that you sort of go, yeah, I guess that could be right, but this is not how paleontologists talk about it. The way that paleontologists talk about it is they're like, it's below my pay grade. Like, I'm not going to, I'm not going to do that. Which is fascinating, right? Because it's really different from fieldwork, right? Fieldwork is something which is treated as like, you're a proper paleontologist, even if most your actual papers are you running computer models. You got to go to the field now and then and get your feet dirty or something. Whereas it seems like fossil prep is not treated like that. So that was an extremely long-winded way of asking you two questions. One was, well, it was really one question, which is something like, what do you make of that really weird thing where on the one hand, there's this clear, an argument a philosopher would love to hear is not what paleontologists are saying at all. And why do they have this differential attitude between field work and fossil prep? Because you can absolutely imagine a context in which they think of fossil prep as being like work in the field, right? You got to get into the lab sometimes and chip away at these things.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's another thing people always ask me is, why didn't you look at the field? Why didn't I start in the field and then continue to the lab and then continue to the whatever paleontologists doing the modeling at their desk?
You did a whole book just on the prep. You don't need to do.
Thank you. I thought so too. Yeah, that's a good question, because of course fieldwork it's certainly an identity defining thing for the scientist. It's also a little bit, it's considered a little bit less skillful, right? Like they bring volunteers to fieldwork sites, they bring members of the public, they do like, pay $500 and you can come dig up dinosaurs with us kinds of events. So fieldwork, they're kind of saying anybody can do fieldwork, although you need to have this expertise to spot what is fossil. But in that sense, you could have one fossil spotter and then a team of people who are like lugging the sand around. In prep, they don't talk about that way. Like scientists do recognize that there are different levels of preparation skill, and that some preparators are better at others than others. And so you can tell that because they'll come to the lab and say like, I want Adrian to prepare this. Okay. Or they'll say, you can give this to a volunteer to prepare because it's easy or it's not that important. So they know that they know that not everybody can be a preparator. And a lot of scientists say, like, I'm so glad I'm not a preparator. It's so boring. It's so tedious. So they are aware. And in like everyday conversations, scientists are not stupid. Like they will say, thank you to the preparators. They will recognize in some small ways that preparation matters, but not in ways that matter in the scientific community, of course, which is, funding or
Yeah. Maybe can I
degrees.
just to draw an analogy, right? So often academics will talk about administrators and they'll be like, this is a good administrator. We need this person. They are crucial like for this. But it's a really interesting thing where it's like they're good because we don't have to, they're able to do that thing that I do not want to have to deal with. And so it's this weird thing where on the one hand, you're recognizing it's crucial and important, but it's almost kind of a necessary evil. And what's good about them is you don't have to worry about it because they're good.
Absolutely. That outsourcing. Yeah, totally. And in the same sense, we all know that administrators run the world. In the same sense, like preparators control paleontology.
Right.
Like in
Yeah, and that's
effect, right?
yeah, good. And again, so it is so interesting because I mean, one of the other things that's going on that's different between the field and the prep is the kind of the visibility is so different, right? Because in certain ways, right? So of course, in a sense, like the volunteer stuff is invisible in certain ways because of public, it's not you don't list all the damn people who are on the field site. But what you do is have news articles. You have, it's part of outreach sometimes, as you sort of
Yeah.
mentioned, but also it's tied up with the mythos of the discovery, right? And there's something really interesting where the more you emphasize the importance of prep, the more you realize that that myth, well, that romantic story about discovering the important thing in the field is just kind of so missing where most of the action is, right? Because even when you do find something, most of the time, so far as I can tell, when you find something exciting in the field, what happens is you find something that you think might be exciting, but you don't know yet. You have to like extract it and then get someone to prep it before you can really say, right? And so there's these sort of clashes between those two things, I think.
Totally. Totally. And I think that's one of the reasons that preparation is so invisible in documentation, that scientists think it's boring and it's also totally out of their control. I would argue they would say it differently, but I would argue that scientists don't know how to prepare. And even though they are technically the preparators' bosses, if they come down to the lab, they can't say, use this glue and not that one, use that tool, because they don't know. They just don't have that knowledge. And so that like extreme division of labor feels different.
Hmm.
So like all sciences have grunt work that scientists say, anybody can wash the glassware, right? Or an undergrad can run that sample or whatever. And preparation is not that. And so, yeah, I struggle to find a comparison because they don't have the shared training that other kinds of scientific technicians might have. And of course, in most sciences, the scientists can do all of the steps. Like
Yeah,
they
I
might not do it
wonder.
anymore,
Yeah.
but they know how to do all the steps of the process. And that's just not true in paleo.
Yeah, I wonder. Coding might be a good analogy, right? So that's becoming less true now because basically almost all scientists have kind of pretty good knowledge of how coding works and can do it. I say that, but lots can't. But certainly a decade ago, right? And still, with the older folks, you've got your like, 60-year-old PI who's your big fancy scientist who has no idea how to use even the most basic programming software. And they kind of recognize that their postdoc and their PhD student, who are these computer whiz kids, have this kind of skill that they don't have. But, and it's necessary for publication, but it's not, they're just really bringing to life their brilliant ideas and hypotheses or something like that. So it's different parts of the epistemic process, right? And it's more visible because the coder gets in the publication. But there's maybe an analogy there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in that sense, coding has become a tool rather than a discipline in itself.
Right.
And so maybe preparation is similar. That also makes me think of I lost it.
That's all
Never mind.
right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so something that I've started feeling, it almost feels a bit conspiratorial, but so the question is why are fossil preparators treated as they are? Something when we talk like this, I find myself sort of thinking is, oh, well, one important part of the explanation is that there is this particular story about paleontological objectivity, which is really based on the idea that there are these things that are bones, roughly, that are in the ground, and we see them, and then we do science with them. And there's this, the more that it becomes clear that there's actually this extremely complex journey that thing goes on in order to then be analyzed, the more that sort of makes noisy and undermines that kind of particular picture about how paleontological knowledge production goes. And so, to the extent that that's right, and I've no idea how far to push it, but it does make kind of looking at fossil preparation actually a really interesting way of really poking right at the center of the kind of ways in which paleontologists construct their objectivity, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, preparators should be a threat to paleontologist objectivity, and they're not,
Right.
because paleontologists have managed to sideline them and divide them from the scientific community so completely that nobody would question preparation as the cause of a scientific fact.
Right. And it's also great from a more broad sort of history and sociology of science perspective, where I take it that, so I've done a little bit of casual work on Mary Anning, for instance. And one of the interesting questions about Mary Anning, so for those you don't know, she's a sort of Victorian fossiler, I guess you might call her. Fossilist. So she found a bunch of fancy fossils in just actually very near to where I am now, on the west coast, southwest coast of Britain. And she was kind of famous. She sold fossils, and as you can imagine, was treated very badly in lots of ways. But one thing that I think that's interesting about the way in which she's very, very much sidelined is that, there's lots of reasons why she was sidelined, but I think one part of the story is that the ways in which she was innovative was in terms of things like fossil extraction and preparation. The stuff that she really sort of was an innovator on were these technical skills. And those technical skills are always sort of undervalued when people tell stories of science, right? We're impressed by the person who comes up with the fancy theory or comes up with the fancy experiment, not the person who builds the damn machine, and so on and so forth. And so I think one thing that's really interesting about emphasizing fossil preparators is that it's a very direct way of going, no, actually, these technical skills crucially matter for how science looks. It was more of a statement than a question.
Yeah, no, I hadn't thought of Mary Anning as an example of that, because usually the argument is that she was sidelined because she was a woman, she was low class. But yeah, that is totally true, especially in terms of illustration. She was a very talented scientific illustrator, and that's in some ways why we have her fossils.
Yeah. Yeah, for the film Ammonite, if you all haven't seen it, has got some, it's a sort of biopic, sort of, about Mary Anning. But the film, the one thing that's brilliant about the film is it pays a huge amount of attention to the craft that she and the other women around her are doing. And so it's really interesting looking at just this very sort of fine-grained techniques that she's kind of figuring out about how to make a fossil look nice, basically.
Interesting, because yeah, she was also part of in the tiny section of my book that has a history. I make the argument that in Mary Anning's time, people thought that anybody could prepare fossils. They thought it was really simple.
Right. Oh, that's interesting, because I mean, well, maybe they said that, but I mean...
Right, because who was doing it? The stonemasons, right? Like incredibly skillful artisans.
Yeah. Why would we think that stonemasons have any particular developed embodied skills to do with how to make stone work?
Right, so classist.
So I guess another question, where that we put things on Tuesday that I thought was really interesting was, how worried should we be about sort of the invisibility of fossil prep? Perhaps turns on this really difficult answer to question that you sort of hinted at when you talked about the lack of the counterfactual, which is, really how often are we going to get artifacts from fossil preparation, right? Really, how underdetermined are they? Because I can imagine it could just turn out to be the case that, hey, yeah, there are these vague differences that kind of matter, but actually at the end of the day, there is not that much wiggle room between how much of the matrix you remove, it's fine. That kind, you can imagine that kind of, in fact, I could imagine a paleontologist making that argument. I could imagine you sort of,
Yeah.
pressing them and them saying, oh, no, actually, sure, they're very skilled and they might fuck up and break the fossil and that sucks. But, they're not, there isn't that much sort of wiggle room. Do you have any sort of, feel free to speculate wildly on that question.
Yeah, I love that question. So as you know, underdetermination is like the one philosophical theory that I really get and find really interesting. I would say within the community of professional fossil preparators, there is some wiggle room. There is some flexibility of how a specimen will look. There is certainly less than in the community of everybody. So the amateur fossil preparators, there's a lot. There's a wild speculation on what counts as fossil and what doesn't. And you can see that, I'm thinking of Mary Anning and the marine reptiles that are hanging in museums all over Britain because they're all over the Jurassic coast. And so these are like giant dolphin-sized skeletons, and stonemasons in the 19th century cut out the stone to make them look like dolphins because that's beautiful and people were going to put them on their walls. And so like that's some serious underdetermination, right? Like that's a big assumption based on this messy skeleton that did not look like a dolphin. So yeah, I think as the preparator community becomes more centralized, it's not very centralized, as I said, they don't have shared training, but they do have a sense of like, they have a name, right? They're fossil preparators. They have like an email list where they swap tips. So there's motions towards them becoming more unified and therefore more skillful. And the other example of underdetermination, I think, is, well, I can talk about fossil mistakes. Let me talk about two examples. All right, so artistry. Within the preparator community, even within some scientists, they say that preparator makes really beautiful specimens. Okay, so they talk about it in terms of aesthetics. And what they mean is the matrix is smooth, or all the bones I want to see are there, or there's no scratches on the bone. So they don't mean beautiful like frame on the wall, but like well done, not distracting, basically. So the preparation just fades into the background of the specimen. And there are particular preparators who are famous for being better at that than others. And most of them have training in fine art. So that's one way in which like an artist preparator is going to make the same fossil in theory look pretty different from a run-of-the-mill preparator. Whether that matters for science, I'm not sure. The other example I would think about is, you read about the foramina joke, which is like one of my favorite parts of this whole project, because it was just so brilliant to see preparators joking about boring holes into specimens that then scientists would interpret as, anatomy, and scientists not getting it. Like that just is so funny to me and so revealing. But yeah, preparators screw up for sure. Every preparator has a disastrous broken fossil story. Sometimes like that was their fault and often not, right? Fossils are really fragile and often you don't know what you're opening when you open a field jacket and you got your electric saw and you're vibrating this giant plaster wrapped pile of rock. And like, yeah, things are going to break. Things are going to jump out at you that you didn't realize were there. And so the argument with them would be, can scientists tell that was broken? And that's an ethical question for preparators. Like, how much of their work do they leave visible? How much do they hide? And that I talk about this in the next chapter of the book, which is about display, because that's really important for display, right? You want skeletons to look pristine and not broken and not with scratches on them for the public. But then you want the scientists to know what part of that skeleton is made out of plaster, right? What part of that skeleton came from another specimen entirely that you put together to build a composite. And so how transparent to be is, I think, a really fascinating question of professional practice among preparators. But I never heard a scientist say, make the fill look different, okay? Yeah. Or don't reattach things because I want to see it smashed. Like, no, the scientists want it to see it like a bone, like it's alive, because that's how they understand the world.
Right. Yeah, so in a sense, you could imagine one version of one way you might characterize the preparator's role, at least in relation to paleontologists, is the paleontologists want to be able to see these as biological objects. and
Hmm.
the role of the preparator is to kind of help realize that. But I was thinking about that sturgeon case, and I think maybe that there's actually a slightly different thing you can say about the sort of underdetermination question, which is, I don't know if I can articulate this right, but it's almost being put somewhat naively in the sense that there's this idea, there's the information that's there. What information might we lose and what information might we gain? And you might say, no, no, think about the sturgeon case, right? There are various different types of ways, different types of information that I might care about, and there can be trade-offs in terms of what information I gain or lose and what gets emphasized based on the way I prepare the fossil. So choosing to disarticulate an articulated fossil, even if you're taking lots of photos and even if you've got your fancy box, is always going to make an epistemic difference, because now there's this extra step, right? There's this extra step that you're making when you're thinking about it as an articulated specimen. And so there's always going to be a sort of epistemic consequence of that. And so maybe there's a sort of move to make this is, look, given that differently prepared fossils are useful for different ends, right? And often in fossil prep, as you say, like it's often not necessarily to do with sort of what we might call scientific ends. Often also it's a scientist wants to look at this and maybe we want to put it on display at some point, right? There's all sorts of different goals that are into play here. So actually another way of running this is really underdetermined is to say, no, there are trade-offs, right? I have to do it one
Nice.
way or the other way and I can't do it both.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And so the one very powerful example of that is bone bias, which is the idea that scientists want to see bones because that's what they've been studying for centuries. And therefore, preparators were looking for bone in the rock. And it was really only within the last few decades that people were like, there might be information in the matrix, in the rock around the bone. And so the feather impressions that we all know are really relatively common on certain kinds of dinosaurs in certain areas. Like, think of all the hundreds of those that have been prepared away because preparators weren't looking for it, because scientists didn't value it.
Mhm.
They were like, if they saw something that looked like the feather, they would be like, well, that's ridiculous. Remember the response to Archaeopteryx in the 19th century where people were like, must be a bird. It can't be a dinosaur. It has feathers, right? Because there was it's like a drawing of a feather. It's so clear.
Mm.
And so in that sense, yeah, things that you see what you expect to see in terms of, there's the danger of theory ladenness. And so whether you decide to prepare a bone entirely is another ethical question. Or, conservators, for example, really push for the minimal amount of preparation so that, if you need to see if you need to see the ear bones of this skull, prepare the ear and leave all the rest of it in the rock
Yeah. Yeah, I'm
so that
sure
it's there.
I'm sure a lot of what you were just saying is probably ringing familiar to sort of archaeologists, right? I take it the archaeologists sort of, at least in my experience, are very aware of both these problems to do with how you view significance and what difference that makes about what you extract from the field and what you pay attention to and then what you just scrub away as not mattering. But also, I really like the point about um, what's the way of putting it? Um, the sort of contingency and kind of you make these decisions. The reason you want to keep the fossil unprepared is that the more you prepare it, the narrower it ends up being in terms of the things you can do with it. And
Totally.
that's really interesting. So before we have a break, I wanted to ask you an incredibly mean question that I was asked on Tuesday, and I was like, that's a really mean question, which is, I think you give an extremely convincing case for the invisibility of fossil preparators being worrying, being something that if you care about the status of paleontological knowledge, you should be like, I'd like to know more. And you said this yourself. We need more metadata on this. It's really weird that they get kind of shuffled away. And sort of a question about what would you do? What would be what how would these people be more visible? What would, take that question to any level of idealization you would like.
Yeah, thanks. Totally. Yes. I mean, I'm an STS scholar, right? And our field is famous for like identifying problems and then walking away.
Yeah, I
So
think
if I were going to do
for
some,
sort of background, we mentioned this before. There's a tendency for like STS scholars to find philosophers of science really difficult because we're weirdly normative and have these weird ideas about rationality. Whereas we find
right.
STS scholars extremely annoying because they'll never, you know what they think, but they'll never say it. Like you know that they think it's really problematic that this thing's happening, but they won't say this is problematic and here's what we should do.
Totally. Because our thought is like, well, what do we know? Whereas you guys are like, we are going to make science better. And so we're going to make a suggestion.
Somehow. But anyway,
Yeah,
make
so
some
true. I think
suggestions.
STS, yeah, please, I would love to. So yeah, STS is moving towards your direction, right? Applied STS, engaged
Mm.
STS, critical STS is all trying to help science be better, really for society rather than for scientists. So in the conclusion of this book, I argue for record keeping. And this is an argument that some preparators make in the sense that we need to have specimen records for the sake of the data and future scientists. And also those specimen records can give preparators some internal power, internal meaning like institutional power, because their name's going to be on that card in the specimen, really in the entry on the specimen database that all future scholars will see when they come to study that particular bone. And so I make that argument because it's a crucial level of data governance. And one, there are technical reasons in the sense that some preparation materials screw up some geological tests. So like carbon dating, you can't use any glue on an object. It screws up the test. And you can't really carbon date fossils, but there are similar geomorphological tests that, basically scientists need to know what glue is in that specimen before they run particular kinds of tests. And so for that reason alone, we need to keep track of what preparators are doing. And then we need their names as a way of giving credit.
Yeah.
And also to be able to go and ask them. Right?
So is the suggestion similar then to so people who care a lot about much more sort of data-driven science will say things like, what we need to do is kind of have ways of publishing things that where data curators get the relevant credit, because it's only by having those sort of incentives, credit-driven incentive structures in place, will we actually get then people spending the damn time that's required to set up the damn database, and then actually, because it's such thankless work that nonetheless is so important. So is there sort of a similar sort of move where it's what you want is like, in effect, the prepared fossil is sort of some form of publication, right? It's getting kept as a record.
Oh, nice.
This person has it attached to their name. You could imagine downstream there being a CV where you're like, I
love that
prepared
idea.
these fossils.
Like a portfolio, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I argue for that rather than authorship on papers for a very particular reason, which is that I think there is a danger of calling too much attention to fossil preparation, because if the world realizes that there's this crucial step in the study of fossils that no one is writing about, no one is documenting, I think that's going to be bad news for fossil-based knowledge. And I live in the United States. There are scary knowledge claims that people make by misinterpreting fossils to argue for young Earth theory, or flat Earth theory. And so I think I certainly don't want to undermine paleontology. And yet I also think preparators thrive because they're not scientists in the scientist world. So they have what some scholars call craft control. They have autonomy. They have creativity. Like they have the power, the control to decide how they're going to approach each specimen within some constraints. And that is incredible agency. And most of them say that's why they do their work. They want to do creative problem solving. They want to develop new techniques. They don't care about being being authors on papers. Really, that was me who cared about it, because I just thought it was so bizarre that they were contributing to the research and not getting on the paper. But yeah, they don't want it. I think it would be bad, because then if scientists are going to put the preparator's name on the paper, the scientist is going to start paying more attention to the preparation when actually the scientist doesn't know anything about preparation. And that's just going to be interference, right? It's going to become top down rather than expertise driven. And so I think a specimen record would preserve the metadata that we need to interpret these objects as data sources, without calling too much attention to preparators in a way that threatens their independence, threatens their status.
That was a beautiful way, I think, to just a segue into having a break. So let's come back at about 25, 26 past the hour, and then we'll spend 35 minutes or so having people throw questions at Caitlin. So thank you. Talk to you soon.
Fabulous. Thank you.
As I say every time, I'm effectively going to act as a chair a greedy chair who will probably find himself talking But anyway, as per usual, raise hands using the reaction button, or throw something in the chat, or just kind of turn your camera on and wiggle around so I can see you, and I'll sort of be able to call on you. So we'll just see if anyone has any initial hands while we start the conversation off. We've got one. Actually, why don't we go with Monica first before we move to the room?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Caitlin. This is great. Maybe I will ask one really basic question. Why you pick Pierre Bourdieu for your theoretical approach? Did you have someone else in mind when you started? What do you think now? Is it really applicable for this case study? And something like that. Can you explain a bit why you pick Bourdieu?
Yeah, thanks. I picked him as a grad student because it kind of is what everybody knows, right? If you're trying to define a group, his framework of habitus, doxa, and the one I'm forgetting, capital, of course, is just so ingrained in social theory that it seemed like a good place to start in terms of trying to define what preparators are as a field, what scientists are as a field, whether they fit together as a field. So I did find it really helpful because of its focus on power and practice. So capital and habitus. It's old, obviously, and there's not a lot done with it in STS now. But there is another scholar, Aaron Panofsky, who uses Bourdieu to talk about interdisciplinary science projects in a way that I find really useful. So he might be making a comeback. And then the other framework I use, I guess not in this chapter, but in the book, is the idea of a community of practice from Lev and Wenger, which of course, again, focuses on the practice aspect that holds them together as opposed to any form of capital. So if you're defining a community just based on what they do together, then actually a community of practice I find quite useful. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. I think Bourdieu is old but gold. So.
Oh, do you? Okay, you sounded so skeptical.
No. I just wanted to check. What do you think about that and why you did it? So thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. I would just add that I tried to do a Bourdieusian prosopography, which is a way of defining a professional group, but it sucked. Like I didn't have the right kinds of data to decide. So a prosopography requires like pretty detailed survey style data about all the members of a community to try to identify what characteristics hold them together. And I just couldn't do it, but I really would have liked to.
Okay.
Amazing. Let's go to the big room.
Hello. Thank you so much.
Не, уключи сега. Само тротик.
Can you hear me?
It's a bit quiet. So maybe if there's a way of like turning the mic up or something like that, that would be good.
Maybe Alexander can do the question before we manage to take care of the sound.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's a sort of a comment. I really like what you said about necessity of documenting things, because in paleontology, obviously, it was.
It's all going very well on the technological side. We'll pause and see if Alexander's going to come back. Meanwhile, how's the volume looking in the other room?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think you can hear me now.
So Alexander, we lost you. Do you want to start your question again, and then we'll go to the big room?
You can go to the big room.
Okay, let's go to the big room and then round back to Alexander. Why not?
Okay, hopefully you hear me now. Caitlin, thank you so much for your paper that provoked quite a lively discussion last time and this time as well. And this time I have a different question about what you said about communicating science to the public, in terms of that you find dangers in that the public knowing every step of the way or how scientific practice works in this moment of time that's also been, as we know, identified as the post-truth time. But I'm wondering whether that is actually, a right way of communicating science, because after all, we don't want to lose, mind of that science every step of the way is done by humans at the end of the day with their own beliefs and agendas and, within their paradigms, which doesn't make it an anything goes scenario. It's either a flat earth or not. But I'm thinking maybe we should communicate it differently, that we also question the nature of our knowledge all the time, which doesn't make it anything goes, if I'm getting myself, if I'm understood, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That's such a great question. And one that I think science studies scholars have been thinking about really since the science wars in the 70s. So yeah, the next chapter is about how fossils are displayed. And one of the fascinating things about how fossils are displayed are these glass-walled preparation labs in museums. And they're pretty trendy in the US. I've seen them in Germany. I've seen them in the UK. So basically it's a prep lab, but with a window on the side so that the public can watch the preparators at work. And in some ways that is amazing in terms of showing the public what scientific practice looks like, because it's ordinary. People aren't wearing lab coats. They have coffee cups out, they have music on, they're chatting to each other. They have like dinosaur cartoons taped up on the walls. It's a very human workplace. And I think that's an incredibly powerful way to demonstrate the human aspect of this work and of science in general. And so in some ways, the fossil preparators are more visible to the public than they are to the scientists. Crazy, right? And so in that sense, like maybe paleontology can be a role model for other scientists to start to show what happens between the data collection and the data and the knowledge making, right? Like what is data analysis? And what does that look like in different fields? Who does it? And so, of course, like just putting a window on the wall is not enough, as you're saying, often because people don't know what they're watching, or they think it's really boring, or they think it's really easy because preparators don't move much, right? You're just sort of watching them go like this. And so in some ways, like, how do you communicate the expertise involved, the judgment involved, and not just like anybody can do this? On the other hand, like it would be great to show a different kind of scientific career as a way of encouraging people to do science, especially people who don't want to go to higher ed, right? People who don't want to bother getting a science degree can be fossil preparators. And so that's a cool message to share. So yeah, in terms of trust in the public, I end the book. So the whole book is in some ways based on Stephen Shapin's idea of the invisible technician, which he was writing about 18th century chemical experimentation. And I don't like that I ended the book with Stephen Shapin, but I did. And he writes about how something like, we have to show the public the warts and all view of science, even if we think it might threaten the epistemic trust in science, because it's their due. Right? Like that we owe that to people to be transparent, to be honest about what science is, and that human aspect of it is what makes it important. It makes it meaningful. If machines were doing science, like we wouldn't care what the outcomes are because they're not human-driven questions. And so I think that view of like, don't show the public because then they'll think that we're making it all up, really discredits the public. And I say that in the United States, where some of our public deserves discrediting. But still, I think if we tried an honest portrayal of science, of an embrace of the human aspects, of the creativity, of the individual judgment and skill, I think it could be a really excellent way to increase participation in science, because people will see it's not just math. You know, it's not just publishing papers. It's not just getting a PhD. There are all these other fascinating aspects of scientific work that we want them involved in.
Yeah, I might come in on this. I mean, one way of thinking about it is I take it there's one of the ways I tend to view this sort of discussion is like, well, there are different types of vulnerabilities that are sort of going on. And one of the reasons why science is often presented simply, right, this construction of scientific objectivity is roughly there's this idea that, well, that will be good because it means people will just trust science. And there's this idea that if you show how messy science is, that will undermine people's confidence in it. But it's only because you've already sold them this idea that science has a strict method and isn't messy, that vulnerability is there in the first place. If people were more, had a better understanding of the way in which science is so human, then that vulnerability wouldn't be there. And moreover, the disingenuous people are going to be disingenuous anyway. This is the thing that I often find kind of weird, is that people are like, so the argument you made was like, when we were talking, was something like, oh, well, we shouldn't pay too much attention to fossil preparators because then the damn creationists are going to go, look, you know, and like I've had my work used by intelligent design people to sort of show, look, science is not as good as people think, you know, and so they'll grab any old thing and do it, which means that we shouldn't pay any attention to them, because if you try and like, you know, they're going to find something to say some nonsense about, right? And it doesn't really matter whether, like, there's no playing into their hands. At least that's my thought. Like, I just don't think you can do something to stop them from doing it. So just ignore them. Maybe.
I hope, yeah, I really do. I mean, it's like democracy, right? Like, wouldn't democracy be great if people just stayed at home and did what the government said? But that's not the point. And so I think you're drawing a comparison with science too, that wouldn't it be great if people just believed what the WHO said about COVID? But at the same time, like, people's views matter too. Like, this knowledge has to make sense within the audience's social worlds. And so I think we need that give and take to make the knowledge better in the sense of being able to serve society.
Yeah, I do love the idea though. Like, imagine if the public image of science included people like fossil preparators and included the more sort of menial tasks in the way in which you might say, you know, oh, when I grow up, I want to be a fossil preparator. Like, I don't think I can be a scientist. I don't really want to do a scientist. I really like the idea of, you know, I like getting my hands dirty. I like, you know, and like, it was really interesting if that was a career in the public imagination, right? Because it is a really sexy career while being, just like paleontology, while being incredibly menial and boring a lot in actual practice. Still, the idea of you're the one who's revealing this thing from the matrix is really, you know, and it's got this artistic, it's a great job to sell, right?
I would think so. I see it as kind of an entryway to get people involved in science who might not otherwise.
Yeah. So wonderful. We should. I just want to check the person who asked the question whether you want to come back at this at all before we go to Alexander.
Oh, sorry.
No, Alexander can ask the question. Thank you for your answers.
Yeah, Alexander.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to ask, who do you think should be doing the documentation? Because the documentation is crucial, as you said, and in archaeology, it's a little bit different because we are not just finding things. And also in paleontology, you spoke about metadata and metrics and the feather imprints and so on. But who should be, who does it? Who should be doing the documentation if preparators are not scientifically skilled, as you said? So it is, I see it as a problem because there are two different sort of skills and knowledge in paleontology, and archaeology is not so, because we destroy our excavation by definition. Most of archaeological excavation is a total destruction, and therefore documentation is something only what's left of a lot of prehistoric, for example, excavations, no architecture or something like that. So this is a sort of question I was wondering about.
Yeah, that's a great question. I hadn't thought about archaeological remains or specimens being mostly documentation based or document based. I was thinking of like potsherds and stuff, but I see your point that buildings you have to go and map them and make the argument for why you think they were there, as opposed to like picking up the building and putting it in the collection. I think the preparators have to do the documentation. You're right that they don't always know what the scientists need to know, which is a problem. I think you're right. It's going to have to be a source of negotiation for the scientists to say, I need to know which specimens have this chemical on them, or I need to know, I need a, I'm thinking of archaeology where you take like samples of the dirt and send it off for other kinds of analyses. And like, that doesn't happen in paleontology really ever, at least not in vertebrate paleontology. And so I'm thinking like if that became a norm, the scientists could say, please save an envelope of the matrix as part of the specimen. And then the preparators could do that. You know what I mean? Like it would have to be a discussion. You're right, where each side heard each other's sides. Because it does require some shared expertise for the scientists to know what the preparators do that is relevant. Because yeah, you're right. They're writing the documentation primarily for scientists, yet also for other preparators. So I'm thinking of like if a specimen breaks in the collection and then a preparator is like handed this specimen that was prepared decades ago and has to sort of figure out what to do. In that sense, the preparator who had documented that preparation first would be writing for another preparator. So you're right, the audience would be mostly scientists and also some preparators. Compromise.
Great. Natalia.
Yeah, hi. First, I apologize for keeping the camera off. I'm not sure that my internet connection is stable enough. Secondly, Caitlin, I really love the chapter and I'm really looking forward to reading the whole book. And the question is more about, I'm curious to know about to what extent the fossil preparators' practice is standardized. And correct me if I'm wrong, if I understood from the discussion, is that it's kind of, to some extent, very subjective. Yeah, comparing to the conservation work, which is quite standardized and you know what you do and there is documentation in place. You have to document each and every stage. So I'm just curious to understand the differences between those two fields. And yeah, and if yes, why so? What's the history and story behind it?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something I struggle with too. Really dating back to my own experience as a preparator, where the US style and the UK style were so different. I mean, it's not standardized. There's no protocol. There are a couple of manuals written, like one's from the 50s, one's from the 80s, and they're like most preparators have them on their shelves, but not everybody. So no, it's not standardized. It's in some ways, that's the beauty of it. That's why preparators like it, because there's so much flexibility to innovate and come up with new techniques. And the way that they justify that is that they argue that each fossil is an individual, each fossil is unique. And therefore the preparators need to be able to use whatever they think is best for that fossil. And I don't mean just like the fossil itself, but within the context of what the scientist wants to do with the fossil and what the resources are that the institution has that houses the fossil. So I'm thinking of like acid preparation, which not every institution does because it's so labor intensive and kind of dangerous. But it does leave really gorgeous, like half exposed articulated skeletons, for example. So like, there are some techniques that you'd think would be universal because they're so cool and so effective, but they're not. It really depends on the institution. It depends on the preparator. Preparators have favorite tools and they swear off other tools as crap. They modify their tools. And so how they get away with that, I think, is partly due to the invisibility. So conservators are a good example of a comparison because, as you said, they really all do the same stuff. It's very documented. They all take the same master's degree. Whereas, in some ways, conservators are more like scientists in their training and in their output. Like they publish papers. Whereas preparators in some sense hide behind their invisibility and protect the flexibility of their techniques in that way.
So I thought I'd come in on this because I'm also fascinated by this lack of standardization. And one thing I find interesting about is, of course, as you know, I'm someone who I'm suspicious of sort of overemphasizing the importance of standardization in science. which is kind of a slightly weird thing to think because standardization is incredibly important in science. And so I find sort of the fossil preparation case really fascinating because I guess what I tend to buy the individuality line. So I'm tempted to say something like, look, given that one, fossils are often really, really different, but also we want to do a whole bunch of different things with them. You know, as we were talking about earlier, you've got that kind of, as you prepare a fossil, the space of what you can do with that fossil diminishes, right? It gets better for certain purposes, like generally speaking, right? And as such, I probably don't want everyone to be using the same materials. I kind of do want them to be kind of trying weird stuff with glue and kind of having this sort of weird risky sort of behavior. So I tend to sort of be pro this kind of wild west of fossil preparation, while also thinking, of course, I agree with you entirely that we want to have better metadata. But now the problem is, hang on a second, it's very hard for me to imagine how you could have a much better organized formal way of doing metadata without that also leading to much more unified, standardized sort of sets of practices. And I guess I'm probably one of the few philosophers of science who would say I suspect that would be bad. I suspect it would be better for them to continue being kind of creative and unsystematic as a population. Yeah, so I guess maybe there's a sort of a tension there between those 2 points.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of preparators told me if somebody told them what to do, which is kind of what a standard is telling you what to do, they would quit. So they are tinkerers. They like to figure stuff out. And I agree with you. I think it's good for the science in some ways as like a triangulation effect. So if we prepared all femurs to look the same, it seems like we're losing all the same kinds of data. Whereas if we prepare each femur as each preparator wants it to be prepared, then it seems like that saves some data. Like this technique will destroy this kind of data, which is preserved in this fossil, which didn't have that technique. If you see what I mean, like it's almost like hedging our bets by spreading out the epistemic risk among the techniques.
Yeah, that's very much how I've thought about it, is that, you know, the really boring way of thinking about it is imagine that the way that all the Americans do it just turns out to be rubbish. It turns out for some reason it just doesn't work. Well, that's okay because the British are doing it a different way. So there's that way of, as you say, spreading the risk is quite a good way of putting it. Let's move to Judith.
Hi, Caitlin. So I got a question. You described a situation in which a scientist barges into the prep lab to have a go. And I just wanted to ask you, how often do you find this situation happening and what do you suppose the motives are?
Isn't that a great scene? I mean, it was horrible at the time. It was horrible to watch. But yeah, like what a dramatic moment that was. That does not happen. That guy was the only guy I had ever seen or ever heard about of a scientist barging into the prep lab and being like, give me that hammer, you know, I'm going to do it myself. Like, it's so offensive to the preparators and also stupid because the scientists don't know how to prepare fossils. Like they're not going to do a good job and they know that. So usually it's in their own interest to back off and, you know, be patient. But yeah.
So that's really interesting because in my experience, there is a kind of sometimes a desire for them to have a go, to actually sort of have the experience of prepping a fossil. And I just wanted to know, so I wonder if that's just our different sort of experiences of this, or whether in the States it's much more formalized or something else. It's just that, yeah, that's really strange because that's kind of different from the things that I've observed. But of course, the scientists don't do it professionally. That's quite true.
So are you saying that like to understand this fossil, the scientist should go and prepare it? Or do you mean that a scientist should prepare?
There's amongst the scientists, there's sometimes a kind of, I really like to have a go at this just to sort of see what it is that I can gain from it by having the experience of doing the prep. It's never done sort of very intensively. It's probably, they don't even finish it. Maybe it's amongst the younger sort of graduate paleontologists that I've met that there is this kind of want to have a go.
Yeah, totally. Preparators beg science students to come and learn how to prepare, because the preparators see it as in their interest that the scientists have some basic understanding of how to prepare, so that they can understand what is an artifact, what is a fact, you know, what is a tool scrape, what is predation. And also so that the preparators think that if grad students, for example, do some preparation, then they're going to get much more respect for the preparators,
Okay.
which is an interesting argument. So yeah, totally. Yeah. I misunderstood you. Yes, preparators definitely want graduate students in particular to learn how to prepare, but it's not typical at all in the US.
Oh, okay. So it doesn't really happen very often, this is what you're saying. Okay, thank
No.
you.
And
Thank
I
you.
guess,
That's really
yeah,
interesting.
maybe just to sort of expand on this, because I'm always because I mean, so for background, Judith has sort of worked with the paleontologists in Bristol and places like that. Like she is
Oh,
a
cool.
paleontologist, and so because your field sites are quite broad, right? Well, broad. They're in like the US and Britain, yeah. Is that right, or is it just? I'm trying to remember what your field sites are, Caitlin. Like what
Oh, my
labs
field
you were-
sites.
Yeah.
Totally.
Right. And so you find, because I mean, I often find one of my very casual Britain versus America generalizations I often make is that America is weirdly more hierarchical than Britain a lot of the time, in these ways you really wouldn't expect, given the kind of the perceptions that British people and Americans have of their own cultures. And so I guess
That's
in a
interesting.
sense that very sort of the way you describe the paleontologists as sort of seeing it's hard for me to imagine what's the way of putting it, that sounded like in my head a very American type of power relation. Of course there are going to be different ways that those power relations exist in other places, obviously, right? But that one that was like, oh, this is a sort of task that's below my pay grade, very, very
Yeah.
explicitly hierarchical, felt very American to me. And I wonder, did you find any, did you see differences in Britain, or more generally, how different are things across different labs, right? Because one thing that's interesting is, on the one hand, you are saying in a lot of the chapter, you're going, here's this particular thing in this lab. People said that this didn't happen very often, but they always spoke about it. And then you're making quite general claims about how fossil preparators and paleontologists interact, yeah? So how much heterogeneity is there in that power relation?
Yeah, thanks. Not much. Strikingly the same. And Judith is right that like conservation is a much bigger deal in the UK and in Europe than it is in the United States. And the argument I heard, or the explanation I've heard for that, is because the US has a lot of fossils. Like there's a lot of active field work. We have a lot of ground that is empty. And so fossils erode out every summer. And there are hundreds of teams that go out to the American West and collect fossils. Whereas in the UK, like there's not a lot of active collecting. There's not a lot of excavating. And so the fossils that they have are more of a finite resource than in the US, where they're seen as like, oh, we'll just go and get some more. And so that's the argument I've heard, that there's very much like a rush to get the fossil prepared. They use super glue and not more conservation friendly materials because there's just so many, or at least that's the mindset, which is bizarre in vertebrate paleo because there's not that many compared to invertebrate, right? Or paleoanthropology, which is the opposite spectrum. Like there's so few fossils of human ancestors that generally the scientists do their own preparation. Whereas in vert paleo, we need more of a sort of factory model.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Reese. Reese, yep, there we go.
Yeah, sorry, I just had to pull it up. But yeah, I really enjoyed the chapter and the article, and I have a ton of questions, but I will keep it simple. So at the very outset, basically the entire chapter is talking about vertebrates. Maybe we're talking about green river fish or dinosaurs or something like that, but they're all vertebrate fossils. And most of my lab work, most of my experience is with invertebrate fossils. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to how you see invertebrate preparation in relation to invertebrate scholars, trilobites, orthocerids, what are those people doing? Because I have a supposition, but I'm not an anthropologist of science. So I would love to hear what you think about it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's funny, right? The name of my book is Preparing Dinosaurs. There's hardly any dinosaurs in this book. Like that was the press being like, people care about dinosaurs. Because so many vertebrate paleontologists work on fish. There's like a million fish stories in this book, because that's just represents, you know, the sort of bulk of what they're doing. So invert, I sort of hung out with some invert paleontologists. They don't really have preparators because they have so many specimens that they think that the scientists can just do it themselves, which is interesting. So the vert paleo part of the spectrum is like, we have too many specimens for the scientists to work on them, but those specimens are so unique in some ways, right? Like we might have one skeleton of one species. That's very common. So we need those singular specimens to be prepared perfectly. We don't have space for mistakes. Whereas invert, you're going to find 100 trilobites. And so if the scientist, you know, dumping them in acid does something a little bit wrong, it's probably going to be fine because there are more. Isn't that interesting? There's really like a supply and demand kind of portrayal. And this is them talking, not me, or this is my summary of how they explain it to me.
That is interesting. Yeah, definitely. I know some people who just dump them in acetic acid and, you know, whatever lives. Maybe greedily asking just one additional question is, I do know that some interaction between, you might call them freelance preparators, commercial preparators, you know, fossil pirates, whatever you want to characterize them as, folks who sell them commercially. And, you know, they probably don't have academic training. Most of the people I know don't, but they're very, very good at what they do at preparing the fossils. And I know there is some interaction with the academic paleontologists, with the scholars of paleontology, relying on them to prepare, you know, exotic trilobites or difficult trilobites or spinos trilobites, things like that. Did you ever run across that in your fieldwork, or is this maybe a little bit too tangential from dinosaurs?
You know, I never went into the amateur side, but that is a vibrant community, particularly in the US and the UK. And as you saw, like, people can learn to be a preparator outside of academia, outside of a museum lab. But the people who work as professionals look down on them. So there's a status there that if you're selling fossils, professional preparators think you're doing a bad thing, even though their skills could well be equal. So yeah, there's that difference. And I think it really just comes down to the moral question of like, whose fossils are they? Are they being sold? Are they going in a collection? Because most professional preparators work for a museum, sometimes for a university. And so to them, like, they are doing this work for the broader community of scientists who are going to study that someday, study that trilobite someday. So yeah, it really gets at their values of like why they're doing their work in terms of that snobbery about dismissing amateurs.
Maybe to do a little bit of, I'm technically teaching this course, just as for those who don't know what's being pointed at here, there are at least two major things, particularly in North American paleontology, that Caitlin and Reese are sort of pointing to. One is the sort of vert versus invert paleontology, where roughly the one way of characterizing it is invertebrate paleontologists tend to think that vertebrate paleontologists are barely scientists. Because partly what's going on is that invertebrate paleontologists have a lot more data and tend to use a lot more data-driven methods, which is one of the reasons why I take it that they don't care that much, as Caitlin put it, you can just wash it all out. And so there's this really interesting difference between the way that, to some extent, you know, like if you're doing like saltwater vertebrate, it's kind of different, but still. And the other distinction is sort of public versus private ownership of fossils in North America is this like wild kind of discussion. So organizations like the Society for Vertebrate Paleontology, the SVP, they are very vocal about the idea that, you know, if you want to have a holotype, it's got to be in public ownership. It cannot be in a private collection. And the thought is, if it's in a private collection, you can't go look at it. It's got to at least be like, there's this notion of you've got to be able to go and look at the damn thing. That's how we get repeatable stuff in paleontology. And so there's these really interesting, very, as you can imagine, with sort of America's tendency towards libertarianism, there's some very strange and wild arguments that go on in North America around the ownership of fossils. It's a fun time. That when we talk to Joyce Havstad in a couple of weeks, I suspect that will come up. and or at least she's a good person to talk to about that. So I just, yeah, we're about to wrap up. I just want to check, Caitlin, are there any other points you want to make before we sort of wrap up? Anything that you haven't said that you would like to?
Oh, that's nice. Mostly it sounds like you got it, even though you're in different backgrounds from me. It sounds like you understood what I was trying to say, which is awesome. So yeah, I hope this book is useful for you. I hope it gives some glory to the preparators and also helps us think through these broader questions of who is doing science and what kinds of work count as science. So yeah, I really appreciate your attention.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank you for coming. Like, it's been such an incredibly fun discussion. Like, the last 2 sessions have been a great time for everyone, I think. And thank you so much for like giving us your time and for writing such fascinating work. Like, as a philosopher of science, it's really helpful to have someone say all the stuff that I can then steal. So thank you.
My absolute pleasure. Steal away.
See you all next week, where we'll be talking about Max.
Thank you.
Thank you.